Welcome to this final panel, streaming live from Geneva at Watches and Wonders. Today we're taking stock of the whole salon. For some of us, and I'm sure for some of you, it can be quite overwhelming when you're confronted with so many novelties during the course of the week. Well, what we're doing today is having a look at those. We're not going to enter into the detail of specific products, but we're going to look at the trends that have emerged and perhaps a look back at what some have called an annus horribilis. Well, let's get started. We've got a fantastic team. We're going to meet them now. Well, my guests today joining me from around the world. We're going to start with those who are not in the studio with us. We have Charlie Boyd. She is the fine jewellery and watch editor at Net-a-Porter. She joins us from London. Then from New York, we've got Nick Sullivan. He's creative director at Esquire. And Chris Hall, also this time back in London, senior watch editor at Mr. Porter. And here in the studio with me in real life, we have Emmanuel Gueit, who is an independent watch designer. And then we have Gianfranco, Ritschel, who I'm sure you remember from across the week, a watchmaking expert at the Fondation. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here. I'm also going to introduce across the studio our two Fondation experts who are with us, Benjamin Tesser and Pascal Ravessou. Welcome again. They will be taking your questions. Do not forget to put your questions into the live chat, because at the end we will come to those questions via Pascal. For us, though, we're going to begin, and I'd like to begin with a large, perhaps philosophical question. We're talking about trends. We're talking about the trends that have emerged this week. What does it take for something to become a trend? Charlie Boyd, I'd love to start with you on that, obviously from the fashion angle. When does something become a trend?
Hi, Belle. I think, the trend it means different things to different people. And I think for me, it's when we sort of see an overarching sort of movement where we're seeing sort of, whether even if it's just a small detail, it doesn't have to be a huge sort of visual. It can be a very sort of tiny detail that we see repeating and repeating across the brands, across the types of watches as well. I think it's when we start seeing things influencing both jewelry watches, or at least for me, my sort of remit is fine jewelry as well as watches. So for me, I think when we're starting to see, each category of watch experiencing the same element, I think that's when we can really take note and say that it's definitely a trend emerging.
Nick Sullivan of Esquire, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it really depends on, you can have a look at it sort of very much in close up, and you have these little wavelets and you notice that everyone started using the same pushes on a chronograph, or then there's much bigger shifts, as we've seen in this scale, to slightly smaller watches that have longer cycles. And I think that the key really is to separate out the things that will develop into bigger waves from things that are just sort of random events. It's really just the more you see, the more you know, obviously. So.
Chris Hall from Mr. Porter, how do you make that choice? How do you separate, as Nick Sullivan said there, how do you separate out those passing fads from a starting trend?
Well, I think Nick put his finger on it just there. It's no news to anyone here, but the trends in the watch industry progress at a slightly slower pace than they perhaps do in fashion, and it can take us a couple of years to appreciate whether, as Nick mentioned, something might be a little ripple or a really growing wave that becomes a tide. You take something like bronze cases or green dials. They've been bubbling up for some time, and now they're incredibly prevalent. And we're seeing them across all brands and across all styles and families of watches. And so I think, as Nick said, the more you see, the more of a sort of helicopter view you have of the whole industry, the easier it is to spot these little trends as they develop and become bigger ones.
Emmanuel Gueit, I'd love to know from the designers. Oh, sorry, Nick Sullivan, were you going to come back on that?
Sorry, I was just going to say, we used to joke in fashion shows, if you saw one thing, that was a direction. If you saw two the same, that was a trend. And if you saw three, it was a tsunami. You don't need to see an awful lot for it to actually develop.
That's very, very interesting, that comment. I wonder, Emmanuel Gueit, from the designer's perspective, when you are creating, do you ever have in your head this idea of trend, or is that something that you leave for others?
You leave for others. You design a watch, and then you listen, you watch what's going on outside, and you design. And that's the trend. The trend is the people who decide what is the trend.
Is there a sense in which, Gianfranco, Ritschel, I wonder if you can come in on this, in which watchmaking trendy, they don't necessarily go together because these are long-term pieces, aren't they?
Absolutely, it's quite a paradox to speak about trends in watchmaking, as the cycles are not so fast and so short like in fashion or other branches. In the watch industry, we have so long cycles, and for us, the difficulty is to see things which are already made a long time ago, like the green color was made in the 60s by some brands, and it came back many times. But the question is, and you began with one question we can talk about ours, is starting from when is a trend? And for us, it's, as I said, difficult to see, okay, is it because a big brand takes this color, or is it because an icon is changing to this color, applying this color? What makes truly a trend? Big question, and as we heard, it's really personal.
Absolutely. Gianfranco, you've been here with us the whole time through the salon. What's the sort of key, what is a key trend that you've identified this week?
Oh, there are a few of them. So we can speak about, for instance, materials. Materials, and there the cycles are really long. So it's nothing which is just, let's say, developed in the last few months, but it's the result of development done in the last few years. For instance, materials development with sapphire. Sapphire was applied a few years ago by 1, 2, 3 brands, and now it's going really like something like which is quite not common, but repeating and repeating. And interesting is how not the sapphire itself is the trendy part, but how you apply sapphire. It means seeing the movement or colored sapphire, this a new evolution, how it changed completely the style of the watch, allowing, combine it with skeleton movements. So we spoke this week about transparency through the materials and through the skeleton movement. That's a strong trend, actually, for example.
So we've got a lot to unpack there in terms of materials. Charlie Boyd, I know that obviously you have a focus as well on jewellery, on fine jewellery. Have you noticed this trend towards sapphire? Are there any other materials you've been particularly interested in this week?
Yeah, I think we definitely have seen the sapphire trend on a jewellery level as well, particularly rainbow sapphires. I think that's been a really sort of key use of the sapphire on the jewellery pieces. But I would say that we've had a really strong offering in terms of gemstones. We've had a really broad range. We've had everything from sort of malachite, really quite bold colours and use of gemstones. So I think that's sort of playing into the sort of combination of colour and material at the same time.
Nick Sullivan, why do you think we might be going into this, diving into colour at this particular point?
I mean, colours come along all the time, and it's always baffling how you see several key watches all with the same vague shade of green at the same time. I still don't. I've been doing this for so long. I still don't understand how that happens. I feel like there's a pub somewhere in Geneva where they're all sitting down to have lunch and talking out of shop. Color, color is a great way and a quick way to refresh a product. I think that's, there are obvious colors, blue, there are less obvious colors like the taupe color that Tudor used on the Black Bay 58, which was, I think, gorgeous. But again, there are some sort of go-to colors that are always going to work especially in tool watches and in dress watches that will come time and time again.
Crystal, do you think there's something about the year that we've lived through that has drawn us towards certain colours or at least bold colours?
Perhaps, but I think, as others have already mentioned, it's important to think about these things in the time frame in which they're being developed. And so, yes, it could be easy to look at it and say, God, what a year we've experienced, and it's great to see now a lot of vibrant, bright tones on watch designs. But I think, honestly, it actually comes from a place a bit further back. And if you think about how high-end collectors some years ago really sort of started to demand more personalization, more bespoke customization, I feel that's trickled down into the mainstream core collections of brands, and the industry has woken up to the idea that customers want much greater choice when they're shopping around. So now you're looking for a watch, it's available in every dial color and every material choice and every size and every sort of mixture of metals. So for me, it's more about that sort of that diversity of choice, and that becoming much more democratized.
That's really interesting. How aware, Emmanuel, when you're designing, how aware are you of this notion of personalization, obviously being important for some brands, and then also the context within which you're designing? Is there a sense that the outside world is affecting you?
No, it's not affecting me. It's just how I feel the world, how I feel my life, how I feel my friends, my family, what's going on, and it's where I go to with my designs.
But so if we're experiencing a year like we've just had, where you're not seeing your friends, you're not seeing your family, you're stuck at home, how does that then affect what you're creating?
It doesn't affect me anything. It's just like I still working design and that's it.
And it's fascinating to think about this pipeline. Chris Hall mentioned that, this idea that actually what we're seeing, the designs that we're seeing now coming to fruition, were not necessarily conceived within the pandemic era. So we're actually slightly out of step. And I wonder, Gianfranco, if you think we haven't yet seen what the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic might be.
Yeah, as we heard it before, I think the changing colors or evolving colors, it's the easiest and fastest way to refresh or to give a new life to a collection or to a specific product. But the reality is development, research and development has longer period, longer cycles, and what it didn't really affect. But there is perhaps one phenomenon which makes last year we didn't see so many novelties, and some brands postponed their launches. So we see more freshness, more vivid colors. In my mind, it's also related a little bit with that.
That's really interesting. There's a theme we have talked about a lot during the week, certainly here at the Fondation, here on set, which is this idea of gender in watches. I'd love to kind of dive into that a little bit more. Charlie Boyd, do you see a shift in the way that gender's approached within the watchmaking world?
Absolutely. I think it's been coming for a little while now, but I think this week has sort of really compounded that movement and that shift. We had the first day of Watches and Wonders, we had Catherine Renier announcing the new Reverso Hybris Mechanica, and immediately, when she was questioned by Suzanne Wong as to whether the ladies' models would be getting a refresh too, she automatically said, well, hang on a minute, this isn't necessarily a man's watch at all, this is just a watch. She put it on her wrist, and I think you could immediately see the point she was trying to make. And she did go on to then talk about further reverso models for, more targeted to the sort of traditionally feminine design codes that we've seen before, such as enameling and beautiful gem setting. But I think that message sort of was very clear, and I think it was a purposeful statement that we are definitely talking about watches in a different way to how we used to. And I think the Cartier launch with the Tank Must is another example where we're seeing very gender-neutral colours. It's even just sort of the labelling, the way we're talking about sizing is changing. And I think we're definitely going to be using sizing as more of a descriptor than we will be using gender. We're not seeing ladies' piece, we're seeing medium, large, extra large. And we're putting it in the hands of the customer. They know what they want, they can pick what they want. And I think having that product pre-targeted for them, it just doesn't feel very modern, it doesn't feel very current. There are so many other product areas, from fashion or luxury, even if you just think about sort of sneakers, trainers, customers aren't used to being talked to in that way anymore. We are definitely shifting in other product areas, and I think fine timepieces will definitely be heading in the same direction.
Chris Hall, I wonder from your perspective, both seeing the fashion world and the watchmaking world, this idea, how ahead of the time or how behind the time is the watchmaking industry on this idea of moving forward with gender parity?
I think, as Charlie said, it's happening and it's accelerating, and it is great that we're seeing that and the conversation is moving and in pace with, I think, yes, what's sort of being discussed in the wider world, in the wider culture. And we see it, for example, to think of one this last week, Vacheron Constantin launches with us the Historiques American 1921, and it's available in 2 case sizes. And I think it might not have been that long ago they would have been explicitly referred to as the smaller women's case size and the larger case size marketed for men. And this time, no, we've had a lot of men come on our platforms, actively shopping the 36.5mm version, and there's that recognition that it is, as Charlie mentioned, about just tailoring our offering to all markets and making sure that people can find what they're looking for without being too prescriptive.
Nick Sullivan, do you think that the watchmaking industry is perhaps being led in that case by the wider fashion industry in that respect?
I think if it's being led, they're on quite a long leash at the moment, and it hasn't really caught up with them. I think the key thing with this situation, I was privileged to sit on a little panel in Miami with Watches and Wonders when it launched in, gosh, how long ago? 2019, about women in watches. And the main conversation at that point was not so much about the design, but about marketing and about the branding. And, you know, I've been in watches so long, and it's always used to be put a pilot, give him a helmet, sit him in a cockpit of his plane, here's the watch. And that sends such a unmistakable message that even if you don't actually say it's a watch for men, it's like there's no look in women. So I think the change really has to come in both senses. And I think in marketing it's changing. I think in design it's changing, and that's being led by the customers.
I want Emmanuel Gueit from your...
The marketing really has to come from inside the brands.
That's really interesting. And I wonder, at the design level, are you ever thinking about that? Do you think it's always to do with the marketing afterwards? You create your watch, they market it how they want, or is there a sense for you, I'm creating this for a particular gender?
No, you create for a particular gender. So which is interesting now that we have one gender and we design for anyone. And on the woman's side, if they want a ladies' watch, is going to be more a jewelry watch with stones and just a piece of jewelry. And then we have one model for anyone, and that's really pretty interesting.
So that's interesting that you still see the very bejeweled watch as particularly female, and the others are more unisex.
And it's going to be stronger,
right.
I believe so.
Okay, Gianfranco, would you agree with that? I mean, do you think that is still the way we see the watchmaking world?
There is a huge paradox. In fact, we are all talking, I think everybody agrees, we are more genderless, and we have even tool watches or diving watches like I introduced this morning, getting smaller, being genderless, yes. And on the website you have 3-4 references of the same model, and you can choose which one do you want. But nevertheless, I agree absolutely. I think particularly you can see it in the feminine watches. You have a smaller and smaller diameter in jewelry watches, coming back to the period where the lady had to wear a little jewel, delicate, with a small movement, and brands developed really micro movement in the 1930s to do that. So if you look at, well, you see few jewelry watches going back in the diameter, but globally, in fact, in the last few years, we had XXL watches, the bigger the best, to more masculine, but we see less of these crazy watches, and it comes back in the standard diameter of less than 42 millimeters to 41, 40, and even 39 for men's.
It's interesting we talk about size when it comes to men and female watches, because it can't be the only decider. There are women who like to wear extremely oversized watches. We have a lot of men on the panel. I'd love to know, put your hand up, men, if you'd ever wear a watch with, let's say, what we could call a feminine amount of sort of jewels on it. Would you ever wear that? Emmanuel Gueit is saying yes, otherwise it's a resounding silence. So what I take from that, Charlie, I'll come back on you on this. I mean, it seems that women can sort of wear across the board. Men are limited. Women now can wear men's watches, whereas men, it seems, are siloed. They aren't, apart from Emmanuel Gueit, wearing as many of the bejeweled watches. Would you agree?
I think it's important to sort of make a distinction between what do we define a jeweled watch as? You know, we can have a day wear watch that has, a nice little spattering of diamonds around the dial, and that's very different to, an enormous cuff piece which is adorned with Lord knows how many sapphires and diamonds. And I think a sort of high jewelry watch piece, I think, is a different kettle of fish. And I think where we're talking about the genderless element coming in is very much within the day wear watches. And I think that high jewelry offering will still be there. Nobody is saying that is going to go. It's just as valid in terms of, the beautiful artistry and craftsmanship that needs to be preserved and continued. But I think, I've definitely spoken to CEOs of watch houses who said that they do have men who are interested in gem set dials. So I think that the market is there. There will just naturally be perhaps a bigger tendency of one group going to one versus the other, and vice versa. It will be there, but perhaps just not as large.
That's really interesting. And I wonder then, if we move into this idea of watches crossing over, there used to be a particular time to wear a particular watch. Is there now a sense, Chris Hall, that the watches we're seeing can be worn in very different contexts?
Absolutely. I do think that's a trend as well, if you like, that's evolved over the last few years. And I do think this is an area where watches are following fashion or menswear a little bit more directly, in the sense that it's no longer, so sort of strictly defined about when you will wear a tank or a reverso. It's not just a black tie watch these days, and vice versa. A sports watch. I mean, you look at the number of interchangeable strap designs that are now being put out by a lot of the mainstream manufacturers. That shows this understanding that your IWC Pilot's chronograph, for example, can suit you for different needs, different moods, different styles, and you can switch it onto calf leather or steel bracelet, or whatever else you sort of choose to use. And it reflects this idea that the defining lines between casual and formal are blurring massively.
Do you see that when you're designing watches, Emmanuel Gueit?
Yeah, you can see that everybody is mixing everything now.
So for you, what does that mean concretely when you're creating?
I don't know. I just design. It's coming like that.
It's coming from the heart.
It's coming from the heart. So
I get a real sense that the kind of design process is almost very divorced from the marketing that happens afterwards.
Well, then the brand do what they want with the designs. We design what we think is cool or it's good for the market, for the brand, and then the brand do whatever they want.
So that's interesting. I mean, then Nick Sullivan, how do then from all these different creators who, if we hear Emmanuel Gueit are sort of creating as per their own want, how do we create trends from that afterwards? How do those brands then shape what's created and create the trend of the season? Nick Sullivan, sorry, that was to you. It's this idea. I don't know if you can hear me. It's this idea of, if we have all these designers working essentially to their own artistic purpose, how do brands then create from that trends? I'm so sorry. I thought we might be able to come back to our guest. Nick Sullivan seems to have disappeared. Chris Hall, I wonder if I can put that to you in that case. If you are still with us and if you can still hear us, how brands are creating these trends across the boards when, if we're listening to Emmanuel Gueit, designers are working very much within their own context? Oh, I'm so sorry. We've got a technical hitch again. We are cursed in the studio with this technical hitch, which is fine because Gianfranco, I can come back on you with that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see, of course, a designer can design his ideas, bring them to paper and offers them to the brand. But today, the brands also, of course, ask the market, they listen, they observe. And the trend, in fact, is I'm old-fashioned. I wear a diving watch for privately, holidays, and I love my diving watch. And the other way, I love an ultra-thin watch with a suit. And today, it's having the same watch covering both purposes, and that's the strong trend. That's why interchangeability of straps, self-interchangeability. You even don't have to go back to the store to do it, you can do it yourself. So this added a new experience, because the other trend is having kind of configurator. When you purchase a watch, you can choose what you want to have, starting from a specific model. You have iPads or applications to choose your personal creation, and that's one experience. Once you're at home, you can continue to play in changing buckles, straps, changing from leather strap to metallic bracelets. That's also a trend which is really obvious today, and brands even offers two or three different bracelet types, not only colors, but types, to really adapt your watch to the different purposes. That's a huge trend today. It's nearly a must.
Do you think then that there's this idea from brands that actually they perceive that customers are buying fewer watches? They're buying maybe the one watch that they want to wear for lots of different occasions rather than buying 5 different watches for different times?
Absolutely. For me, that's the trend. I buy a watch which is able to adapt itself, or I adapt it itself to my daily mood, to my daily activities, to a new style, or combining with accessories, with a car color or lipstick for ladies or whatever. That's the huge trend actually, which is funny because it brings a new way to judge, to love, to appreciate, and to have watches, which doesn't replace to buy another one, because it's just beginning to play with and having more and more fun with it.
Definitely. We heard a lot about personalization through the week. Charlie Boyd, are you still with us? I'll ask you the question before I go to you. Yes, I can see you're smiling, so I'm hoping you're still with us. I'd love to know from you whether you've also sensed a trend from customers, a demand from customers of this personalization of a watch.
Yeah, I would say so, but I don't think it necessarily has to be anything as sort of explicit as sort of, I think there is talk about engraving and messaging and, personal inscriptions, but I think actually it can be something as small as sort of different Roman numeral hour markers. I think that the Rolex piece introducing the sort of orange enamel is very personal. It's a little unexpected nugget that you're not necessarily used to seeing, and I think that alone can be personal. And I think strap choice, again, huge amount of offering there where you can find sort of something that suits you. I think we've seen a lot of discussion, certainly within our content, between bracelet straps and watch straps in terms of the more traditional leather options. And I think that is definitely being looked at by women particularly. I think as we are talking about this shift between what we're wearing in the day, now basically being what we wear everywhere. We're not dividing our wardrobes into sort of workwear, sportswear, leisure wear anymore. They've all melded. And I think although we want something personal, we still want something that can sort of survive all of those different phases of our day and our daily lives.
That's really interesting, particularly in the context of the year that we've all just lived, where our workwear and our leisure wear has really blended into one. Chris Hall, do you feel that personalisation has a contribution to make there?
Yes, definitely. As I sort of mentioned earlier, I think that's gone from being the preserve of the absolute sort of top spending big clients who will order a bespoke piece, and down to being something that everyone expects, at least to be available to them, if not necessarily everyone's taking advantage of it. And as others have said, it can manifest itself in a number of ways. It can be buying a watch that will patina in a way that's unique to you, or it can be buying a watch with a hard stone dial that is never going to be exactly the same as the next off the workbench, because it's sourced that natural material, and everyone will be different. So I think it's not necessarily so much about choosing a personalized design, but also just choosing designs which will become personal to you over time.
How far do you think brands are willing to go, Chris Hall, with this idea of personalisation before they are concerned that they're handing too much power over to the customer?
Well, I mean, you'd have to ask them, but I think certainly if we look at what's happened over the last few years, we see no sign of it slowing down. If anything, I think brands have shown a greater willingness to listen to their customer than ever before. And as we've talked about in terms of the sort of the widening scope of what's on offer, honestly, I think we couldn't be living at a time of greater choice in watchmaking, and that can only be because the brands are listening.
That's really, really interesting. Emmanuel, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Brand or people start to understand that luxury watches can make change you can play with since the Apple Watch arrived on the market, because with the Apple Watch you can play. And it's been the main story about the Apple Watch since day one. So people start to play and they say, hey, I can do it with my Rolex or my Audemars Piguet. So the brands will need to understand that they need to have this system as well.
That's really interesting. So this idea that the connected watch actually has informed almost the traditional watchmaking industry
it's not
as well.
the connected watch, it's the bracelet, and you can play with colors and change whatever you do.
Yeah, so changing the strap is part of that. Yeah. Nick Sullivan, on connected watches, just because we mentioned them, welcome back. Good to have you back again with us. On connected watches, we used to hear a lot about them, but it seems like we're not hearing as much about them anymore. Do you think there might be a reason for that?
I think that the brands that really want to do them, and of course, Monsieur Biver with Tag was very, very, very sort of in the game early. I think the brands that really want to do them are already either about to launch them or already have. I think the big issue for a lot of those brands, and that was clearly the case with Tag Heuer when they launched the connected watch, was how do we make a digital product a gateway drug to mechanical products, because obviously they want people to grow up and start wearing mechanical watches. And of course, they're completely different mindsets. And I think I know lots of watch collectors who have an Apple Watch because you kind of have to. It's a thing, but using them is very different. So really, the key thing is I think a lot of brands have stopped short of going into that because they're not seeing the translation of people who may otherwise not have worn a watch at all, wearing a connected watch and then not translating that into a mechanical watch. The short answer is I don't really know, but they're different animals. They're different animals.
They're completely different animals, aren't they, Gianfranco?
Completely, and I was really wondering this year how many brands would launch new concept with connected watches. We spoke about it during years, as you said, and I was really surprised. I didn't see nearly nothing. So, what is the message behind it? Should we be even more connected, or should we perhaps go back and to be connected with our own values, with our own story behind the watch? And that's for me an interesting message to see how interior design is growing during this hard period. And people are looking more for things they love, they speak to them, and a watch, probably the same evolution is going on.
Yeah, and it's such a particular world, the world of watchmaking. We have, we've been immersed in it for the last week, and now, of course, we've got our guests who are in the world of watches, but of course also in the world of lifestyle, of fashion. I wonder where we feel collectively that the emphasis is when we look at this year's offerings. Is it on style? Is it on the rigor of watchmaking? Nick Sullivan, perhaps we could start with you on that.
Well, it's something that's sort of crept up on me, in fact, and it was the realization that tool watches, which are the mainstay of a large part of the industry, certainly for younger, well, actually all ages of collectors. But I noticed a little sort of swing back towards something dressier in terms of the use of precious metals. The Tudor Black Bay 58 in 18 karat gold, and then in silver. I can't remember the last time I saw a silver watch. Then I saw, with the Aqua Race from Tag Heuer, where they've sort of sharpened up a lot of the details. It feels glitzier, and we were talking a little bit about that sort of one occasion watch. Is that it feels like the tool watches thing is moving out of the purely authentic nuts and bolts heritage diver to something a little posher, which suggests that actually the dress watch and the tool watch may even be moving together very slowly in terms of I'm talking a long-term direction. I don't know whether that's true, but that's what.
It's certainly interesting to think of that as a trend. Crystal, how much, when you're looking at the watches that are coming out of a year, how much are you thinking about tourbillon and complications, and how much are you looking very much at the aesthetic?
Well, I'm as interested in a tourbillon or a high complication as the next watch fan, and I think it's valid to look at the headlines and the imagery. Obviously, this is a very visually led industry, and to think, yes, okay, the dominant narratives here are about style and design. But I would also think it's worth, as you say, calling out some watchmaking rigor that doesn't necessarily get all the sort of plaudits it might. I think behind the scenes, brands have actually put quite a lot of time and effort into increasing some of the real basics that make a watch easier and better to live with. Power reserves are up, efficiency is up, whether that's because they're using ceramic components or whether that's because they've just enhanced the construction of their gear train and rejigged the efficiency of their balance wheel or something, and service intervals correspondingly are up. So overall, you're seeing a lift in that sort of quality of life, if you like, for a watch customer, as well as seeing, yes, brilliant choice and brilliant new design moves being made left, right, and center. I actually think it's worth paying attention to the fact that brands are really improving the basics, if you like, as well, and that's quite significant, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Emmanuel, Gueit, from your perspective, how do you tread that line? How do you balance between the very technical and then the aesthetic? It
all depends on the brands I'm working with. I got a chance to work on the DNA of the brand, and I go down deep to the historic of the brand, and then I can design very easy. For a new brand, I start from scratch, so that's my imagination. But when I work for all brands, the DNA is very important.
And so you have to immerse yourself in this world before you can start designing.
Yeah,
that's really interesting. Gianfranco, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it was interesting to see how even the complication evolved in the last few years, where brands tried to prove their skills, the ability to develop complicated mechanism, visible, voluminous. And then we had this period where it had to be, yes, technically difficult, but also aesthetically harmonious, so symmetrical or ultra thin. And so that was the second challenge. And at the same time, or today, more and more, yes, crazy, yes, beautiful, but also reliable and comfortable. And that's the mix in having complicated watches or technical tool watches, but just not too extreme. Just you can wear it with a suit, and it just expresses your values or your private life in a smooth way, but not too pushy.
Now, I want to just introduce a new theme, which we have certainly talked a lot about this week, which is particularly for the brand, sustainability. It's everywhere within the wider world as well. It is also in the watchmaking world. How much of a trend do we think sustainability has been? How is it being incorporated into the world of watches? Nick Sullivan, can we start with you on that?
Sure. I think we're still, in all sustainable efforts, is always it's a path. I think we're just on the beginning of it with watches. We've seen, quite a few really commendable attempts to make recycled straps, to pour money in to save the oceans and various operations like that. But I think the big move this year was Panerai's ELAB ID watch, which must be very frustrating for them, 98.6% recycled. Which I think is a fantastic effort. But I think the most important thing about it is that they're making all their findings open source. And I think that's the really key thing. And I think it's up to the other brands to see whether they can follow suit, want to follow suit. I think that recycling a strap is one thing, or making a strap from non-leather products is one thing. Recycling the watch is another altogether.
Crystal, do you have optimism in this field?
Yeah, I do. I think everything has to start somewhere, and as Nick said, maybe we are still closer to the beginning of this journey. But it's definitely different from anything else we're discussing today. It's not a trend, because trends may come and go, but this, I think, should now become part of what watchmaking is about for the foreseeable future. And yes, Panerai has taken a big step this week with the ELAB ID, and obviously there are the Luminor pieces with sort of recycled steel, which make that immediately available to today's consumers, as well as this sort of trickle-down tech, which hopefully we'll see in the next few years becoming more widespread. But yeah, I think the number of brands that have showed a willingness to engage with the ideas, not just of environmental conservancy, but actually the business of running a sustainable watch company, like, for example, IWC, is encouraging. Very much so.
Yeah, it's really interesting, obviously, yeah, in governance terms, of course. And then I wonder, in customer experience terms, Charlie Boyd, maybe you could speak to that, this idea that, when we talk about the packaging of a watch, how can that be sustainable?
I think every brand is doing it differently, and I think, as Nick said, there's been some really amazing efforts to put that forwards and sort of really push that area. But I think also we've got to sort of acknowledge the fact that these are timepieces that we are going to keep forever. The longevity of this category is enormous, and I think it's very different sort of talking about boxes and packages when we're thinking about fast fashion, whereby those boxes are being chucked out pretty much immediately. But I think with a watch case box, there's something that often people keep the entire length of the watch. They're almost used as sort of presentation cases. So I don't think it's quite the same problem as it is in other areas of sort of style or luxury.
Emmanuel, Gueit, have you ever been working with sustainable materials or been made to think about this as a designer?
Yeah, especially for straps, but that's it. But I do believe this is not a trend. It can't be a trend. It must be the normality within the next 5 years for all the industry. Metal, straps, packaging, that must be the trend for the next years.
Yeah, so perhaps we're not then talking about a trend, we're talking about a new normal, Gianfranco. Yeah.
It's a huge shift. It's a metamorphosis. We are changing completely the rules, because luxury, a part of the luxury was also kind of egoistic approach. I have this material, I use it, not you. And today it's exactly the contrary, will be exactly the contrary. I want it, but I want to do something well. So that's a switch which is going on. And I think the leather strap is just a little part, the visible part. There's much more ongoing in the backstage on the materials. We spoke about the diamonds and precious stones. That was the first wave, but now we're talking about gold and the raw materials globally, not only the precious materials. And for me, the interesting observation I made during this fair here, it was to see how the brands, many brands already made fantastic things in the past in relationship with sustainability, but it was not so visible. And then you begin to judge, it's okay, it's ethical, but it's not so good. And today we can, through new technologies, tell the story behind, make the invisible visible. So people really can see, feel, be participating to what the brand is doing to protect something or to make it more ethical and really apply it. And the watch or the part of the watch is just the result of this approach. And that's a positive side of the technology we have to apply today. It brings all that in a more visible way to us as consumer.
Yeah. Now we've got 5 minutes left before we're going to audience questions. I'd love to sort of take a step back and just, because we're talking about trends, the overarching view of trends. We have 2 people, I guess, more from the watchmaking world itself here, and then of course joining us virtually we have the lifestyle fashion watch kind of crossover. For the 3 of you, I'm talking about Charlie Boyd, Nick Sullivan, Chris Hall. For the 3 of you, I mean, for us, you seem like the trend setters in that you see what happens and then you create, you find, you tease out those trends. Are there any others that we haven't spoken about so far that you'd like to kind of bring to our attention? Is there anyone who'd like to start, or shall I pick on someone very unfairly? Because I tell you what, because you're oh, go on, Nick Sullivan, you go ahead.
No, I need 1 second to think.
You need 1 second to think about it. Chris Hall, would you like to start us off on any of those?
Gosh, well, I do feel like we've had a really thorough sort of overview of the trends that we might discuss. Honestly, whether it's skeletonization, whether it's a different approach to materials and metallurgy and incorporating that wholesale into the design process, whether it's, I mean, I'm at a loss to find a trend that we haven't necessarily picked up on.
Is there one, you don't even, it doesn't need to be a new one necessarily, but is there one thing that we've talked about in the course of this discussion that really for you is, you know, your takeaway? If you were going to go and write about it tomorrow and you say, right, I've got to pick one trend this year, is there something that would be your takeaway?
My takeaway is something that encompasses quite a lot of the trends we've seen all brought together under one umbrella, which is this idea that if you're looking to buy a watch in 2021, I genuinely believe you have more choice available to you than you've ever had before. Even if you've homed down on the brand and the model you're looking for, you're still served with a variety of case diameters, case thicknesses, dial finishes, case finishes, etc., etc., etc. And I think that kind of choice is my trend of the year, and it may not be too sort of profound, but I genuinely do think it sums up where we're at.
No, I think that's brilliant. I think there is profundity in that, or profundity in that rather. Charlie Boyd, for you, would you agree with what Chris has said? Have you, from your perspective, have you seen another trend emerging that's your key trend?
Yeah, I totally agree with Chris. If anything, I think for the women's side of things, we've been given more choice than ever before. You know, I think the fact that we're seeing day watches where we've got everything from little small dainty dials with a tiny little bit of diamonds that we're sort of used to, going up to much larger pieces. You know, Cartier's new Ballon Bleu at 40 millimeters has been really, really popular. It's been a real takeaway from the show. So there's that, but then there's also a couple of other little details as well. I think cushion-shaped cases has definitely been something that I've noticed. You know, from the Vacheron Constantin Historique Americain 1921, we've seen it there. We saw it again at Chopard with more of a jewelry style watch. But I think also the sort of bracelet element for the women's sort of more jewelry piece when it comes to sort of little cocktail watches, we've definitely seen with the Limelight Gala from Piaget, we've seen that Palace Decor technique, which very much, as Chris mentioned earlier, does create an individual watch for each person because that craftsmanship is done differently on every dial. And that sort of similar technique has been used on a couple of the bracelets too. I think sort of gold etching with almost a very sort of 70s glam vibe has definitely started to rear its head again.
That's really interesting. Nick Sullivan, can we hear from you on this, or do you want a little bit more time?
Yes. I think it's a bit of an offshoot of the sustainability argument. And I think, you know, there is almost a duty for the watch industry to make itself understandable to a new generation of potential watch owners by changing patterns of behavior in terms of employment, in terms of marketing, in terms of the watches they're making, and really trying to communicate that watches have actually been smart for 500 years. And particularly now, a watch that is autonomous, that is made of materials that are going to last for 100 years, which is unthinkable if you own a smartwatch because it's out of date in 6 months and you need to upgrade it. There's a little connect that needs to be made with that younger generation to understand that just because the technology is old doesn't mean it's very much up to date, especially now.
Really interesting, thank you. Let's hear from our two watchmaking experts here in the studio as well. Emmanuel, Gueit, is there a trend for you that stuck out?
I think that this year was less classy and more sporty. Less classy, the style of the 30s, 40s and 50s, go towards to the 60s and 70s, which is very exciting because those 2 decades were very super creative. And we're still living on the creativity of this period of the century. So we have a very good future in the watch industry, in the design industry.
That's really interesting. So a move towards more sporty. I'm hoping we'll come back to that in our Q&As at some point. Gianfranco, what about for you?
2 points it's spotted out. It's the technical side. The complications are less crazy, less extreme, less added one over the other one, and more stylish. They are still here, but more, just aesthetically discreet and perhaps less, but better. That's one point. And the other one, it's sustainability. I think we are in the luxury watches industry, and we still was meaning, wow, watch, there is no problem. It's precious metal and it lasts long time and all your life and other lives. But the sustainability is not only afterwards, it's also before. And we are having a closer look what happens before. And that, as we said before, it's really a huge change coming now. And the brands are working really well on that. And I'm really surprised or thrilled to see what happens in the next 12 months.
Okay, interesting stuff. Well, we do have to move now to our questions. The audience, thank you so much. You've been putting your questions in. Pascal, you've been going through them with Benjamin. Do you want to start with your first question for us?
Yes, well, first of all, a few reactions. We have a couple of comments, like it's great to see all these wonderful novelties digitally, but we cannot wait to see it in real. So that's really a cry from the heart, probably.
You get two, want to be able to touch these pieces.
We all are in the same state. Then, interestingly, on the gender thing, we have a quote from Dan Andre, a gentleman, saying that I love and wear a 33 millimeter watch. Would love also to wear some of the 36, 38 millimeters with diamonds dedicated to ladies. The line between ladies and gentlemen should not exist. Fair. And then we have Maria, obviously a lady that is writing us, saying, do you think that the genderless watches are perhaps an excuse for why brands are not developing something specifically for women? So it's quite, quite an opposition. Probably a long debate is going to take place on this gender thing. I don't know if someone wants to react.
Well, Emmanuel Gueit, I wonder if you think there is a need, perhaps, rather than for across the board for genderless watches, rather than thinking, you know what, we'll create some that can go for both genders and then some specifically for women. But I don't know, for you, do you think there's a need to develop this further, that we need to move to a point where we no longer speak about men's watches, female watches?
Some brand does very well to design only women watches, and they're very successful. There is a niche, there is a market. So is jewelry watches and semi-jewelry watches, but piece of jewelry. Like I'm talking about Bulgari, for example, the Serpenti, it's very a piece of jewelry. But there is a huge request about a non-gender, and you can see the brand, they reduce the size and to match and to make everyone happy.
Charlie Boyd, I wonder on that, do you feel that like the questioners we had just there, do you feel that the women who want to wear traditionally men's watches and the men who want to wear traditionally women's watches are the exception rather than the norm at the moment?
I think it's going to change. I think it's going to evolve. For me personally, you know, I don't sort of really feel the need in any other areas of my life to have a product that is specifically dedicated to me, when it's sort of a functional piece or a beautiful piece. For me, it feels much more democratic to make sure that we have one product that caters for all of us. You know, these days, it's kind of baffling that we're still sort of talking about women's lifestyles versus men's lifestyles and sort of the products that should work within them, because to me, you know, we have no difference in the sort of goings about of our daily life, and for me that should be reflected in the product category.
That's really interesting. Gianfranco, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I made once a nice exercise to answer this question because, in fact, we are mostly geeks in the watch industry, and there are more masculine geeks than ladies in the watch industry, probably. I hope it changes soon. But I made an exercise counting how many models I can identify which are produced only for women's, exclusively, which never exist as middle size or for men's, exclusively for women's. And I was really surprised to see how many there are and how some brands are really specialized in it. So let's open our eyes in the future to talk about this kind of watches too. And it will be a market for itself, for sure, even if there is this gender mix, yes, but the extremes, technically masculine and exclusively feminine, will stay, for sure.
Emmanuel, Gueit.
In the 60s and 70s, they were very famous to have design for women and design for men. So we come back now to this kind of direction.
That's very interesting. We come back to it in the design terms.
In the design terms, like in the 70s, where people were designing, producing watches for women and for men.
Yeah, but then in the brand term, it's perhaps this move towards let's have one, you know, one watch that anybody can wear. You choose whether you wear it as a man or as a woman.
But it's different use.
Yeah,
It's like the ready to wear and haute couture.
Yeah,
that's
very different things.
Yeah.
Pascal, do we have another question?
Yes. Obviously, it keeps coming back again and again. We see a lot of green watches come out at the same time. So I'm going back to Nick's point about why is it that everyone is gathering with the same color? But basically, was it an effect of the pandemic bring a light and bring a kind of a hope-carrying color?
Interesting. Oh, because green has a particular meaning. Perhaps, am I right in thinking, particularly in the Asian market, green has a particular meaning? For you, when you start to create a watch, Emmanuel, do you fixate on the color first? How do you approach color?
You work with every colors, and then there is one winner. So you don't decide as a designer, tomorrow I'm going to design green. You design green, pink, red, blue, blah, 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 and then the market will decide.
And this year, did you find one color was sticking out? Did you find it was green this year as well?
Oh, green is the new black.
Gianfranco.
But have a closer look on which kind of green the brands are talking about. I made this game. I counted how many words was applied just before green to describe the green.
Yeah.
Do that game, you will see I counted more than 10 different kind of green: olive green, military green, British green, and mint green. So you see, there is not just the primary color like we had. Many brands made colored collections, but now it's a little bit more sophisticated, at least.
From the fashion and the lifestyle perspective, how important is it if we say green like that? You know, how do you guys also think, right? Well, that's it. That's the green is the trend this year. How important is that for you, Chris Hall?
I think it's unavoidable that there have been a lot of green watches produced, and yes, as Gianfranco just mentioned, in an ever wider array of different shades. But it's not the be all and end all. I think that if you fancy a green watch, you have that choice now, and you didn't used to. But there are brown watches, there are blue watches, there are black, and there are obviously the classic classic black and white dials also available to you. Honestly, so I think it's as much about good designs are the designs that work when you apply any color to them, as Emmanuel was sort of saying there, and I think that resonates with other products too and other categories. So yes, it's green now, and perhaps in time it will change again, but it's just a sort of a welcome aspect of choice.
Yeah, Emmanuel Gueit saying that's fashion. Exactly. These trends, they come and go, and they are seasonal rather than long term.
Which is cool, actually.
It's cool.
Yeah, it is.
In the watchmaking world, though, is it cool because they expire. The expiry date on a fashion, on a trend, on a fad is shorter than a watch.
Then you buy a new watch.
Actually,
If you can afford.
If you can afford.
actually,
Pascal.
interestingly enough, we just had a comment that saying, yeah, in fashion it's fair to have color changing every season, because you buy like a $50 item, whereas a luxury watch is like 100 or 1,000 times more expensive. So you can't have the same rhythm. But
Well, then buy a black watch. Like a black tie watch.
there's still a warrant.
Yeah.
Black watch will never go out of fashion. It's interesting because I sense a reticence from our three virtual panelists here to talk too much about colours as though they're that important. It feels like it's something very kind of internal. It's very easy to spot these colour trends, but perhaps we shouldn't take too much from it. Pascal.
So let's go away from the colors. From Lulu, a question about neo-vintage. Do you think the market demand for neo-vintage watches will disappear, or is it a segment that is here to last?
Very interesting. Emmanuel, do you want to talk about neo-vintage? No, not so much.
No.
Let's ask it from our fashion perspective. Gianfranco, before we start with that, for you, we've spoken here about neo-vintage.
Absolutely, and that will stay, because even if the design is getting more smooth, not so aggressive anymore, not so technical anymore, but the inspiration stays from the past, where the watch was a true tool or requested necessary instrument to have the right time. So we are still inspired from this past. If you have a look on the novelties, there are only few completely new designs. Most of them are redesigned, adapted designs from the previous periods to today. So I'm sure the watch industry continues to go in the future looking backwards. But just a little bit backwards.
Playing with time, effectively. Charlie Boyd, I wonder, because you also spoke about this idea of re-editions. Do you think it could have been anything to do with the fact that the whole world ground to a halt for a small amount of time last year, and then sort of very slowly was coming back up? Do you think perhaps that had an effect, and there were more re-editions because of that?
I'm not sure I would really put it down to that. I think at the moment people are looking to find a timepiece that is, like you said, personalized. It's an expression of your own identity and your own style. So I think they're looking, customers tend to be looking to iconic pieces. They want pieces that pack a big punch. And I think that can be often from heritage. I think particularly within sort of our world and the sort of women's side of things, I think, we're now buying into those big heritage brands, and we're not feeling as if we're sort of out of place anymore. And I think sort of the gender things help that as well. I think because people are buying more online, we're perhaps not being directed into sort of the ladies area of the shop. Now we're discovering pieces across the whole website. We're not looking at the gender, we're not looking at the category. So I think we're perhaps more focusing on the brands behind the pieces. And the sort of individual legacies of each model that we can now rewear.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This idea that heritage, I mean, it's running counter to the idea that we were talking about before of trends and colours that can expire much more quickly. Pascal, do we have time very quickly for one last question?
Yes. Interestingly, in terms of personalization, there is a question around, we've seen coming up many tools for personalize the watches, or even made an order. What, in your sense, is the limit for brands if they really want to please the customer?
Yeah, so we touched on this before. This is this idea that at what point does a brand cease to be a brand if it gives so much personalization, so much choice to its customer? Chris Hall, I know we've spoken a lot with you about personalization, but I wonder if you'd like to come back on that. Just, at what point does the brand push back and say, this is no longer a X brand because you've personalized it too much. It no longer looks like us.
Well, that is a fascinating question, I think, and if you're sort of really active in the watch community, you'll be aware of very sort of quite rare and quite hard to find personalization or customization products that have always been available to perhaps the top end collectors and the most most discerning clients. So I don't think there's necessarily a line in the sand for anyone or for any brand. But when you look at what they will design and put into mainstream production, it's a different story, because every brand knows their sort of the parameters within which they operate and sort of the things that perhaps will and won't work, whether it's beige ceramic or a particular shade of orange on a dial. Honestly, I think the case can vary. It can vary brand by brand. It can vary in terms of the sort of the enthusiasm and the approach. Every brand takes a vastly different attitude to how much they will customize their iconic designs.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick Sullivan, on that idea of personalization, do you think brands have still got a lot further to go, or have they sort of gone as far as they can on this?
Well, there's two. In favor of it, I'm very much in favor of offering as much personalization as possible, because the newer, younger generation, that's what they expect. They expect a user experience that their parents didn't expect. You just took what the brand gave you and you worshipped it, and it's fantastic. And I still do that too. But you know, there is at the same time there's a whole culture coming up around, you know, a certain big Japanese watch company that has a whole modding culture that the company itself has no control over. It's all third-party parts, and super nerds are changing the dials and changing the bezels and changing the hands, and they're insane for it. But the company loses control of that, and then there is also the question of, is that watch still then a watch that they can call safe, serviceable? Is it still waterproof because somebody's been tinkering about with it? It's a bit like get an Audi, take the engine out, mess it around, put it back together, and then take it to Audi and ask them to check it over. They'll say, well, you know, that's the difficulty. If someone can invent a modular system that would work, that would be amazing.
Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder if I hope the brands are listening and they might take that on board. Thank you so much to all my guests. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you, the audience, for your questions. Some key words from us today in terms of trends: choice, playing with shapes, sustainability across the board and everything that means, more sporty designs and more discreet complications. That's our last panel for this week. It's been a real pleasure to be with you this whole week. Thank you again to all of our guests who have joined us from around the world for these panel discussions. They've been absolutely fascinating. From all of us here in Geneva, thank you and goodbye.